So the final 14 or 15 slides are about being a good reviewer for a journal. So this is something that I thought I should put out here for the benefit of some of the newer members. So one needs to understand is being a reviewer is not something that comes to you naturally or intuitively. It is something that takes a lot of training and experience, and you need to learn to follow certain processes and do them over and over and over again, and each time figure out what you could have done differently and then improve on that. I mean, it's basically a replica of what you need to do for being a good surgeon. It's the same skills or same principles apply here. So the reviewer basically has two roles. It helps the editor decide what that article, what should be done with that article. Should it be accepted outright, accepted with revisions? Does it require major revisions and has to be reconsidered only after that, or rejected? To my mind, the second and equally important role of a reviewer is to give constructive feedback to the author. I've used the word criticism. I think I need to change that to feedback. It has to be a constructive feedback to the author. Whether the article is accepted or not, even if you suggest to the editor that an article is to be rejected, you still need to give a constructive feedback as to why you felt that the article is not worthy of publication in this journal. It does not mean the article is not suitable for any journal on the planet. It has to be a constructive feedback which the author would value a lot and would try and improve the article based on that feedback and maybe submit it elsewhere. So the first thing I'll suggest to you is familiarize yourself with JMAS. Go through the instructions to authors which are available on this page and see what the journal expects the article to be, and browse through the issues if you're not already doing so, to see some of the previously published articles under various article types and get a feel for what the article in JMAS should be like. The next is an important aspect. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you submit an article to a journal, and I'm sure most of us who are a part of this editorial board have gone through this process of submitting our articles to journals, how would you want a reviewer or an editor to deal with you? So please remember in your review, when you're writing this, as one of the most important aspects of communication with the author, avoid any demeaning or insulting statements. Avoid sarcastic comments. The basic thing to remember is you're dealing or you're interacting with the article and not with the author. Get the author out of the picture. So even if it is a harsh criticism, the harsh criticism should be directed towards the article, the way the research was conducted, or the way the article was framed, or the way the authors did not do something. It should not be directed ever at the authors. So just quickly to take you through the process, if once you receive the article, some of these steps may already have been taken care for you by the editor or the sectional editor, but still worth going through it. First, decide whether it conforms to the category in which it is submitted. So sometimes it's an article purely focused on a technical aspect of an operation. That would go better as a how I do it or how I do it differently article, rather than being an original article or a case report. Does it conform to the format, the word limit, does it have the correct sections? Or original should stick, as we know, to the IMRAD, the introduction, material, methods, results, assessment, and the discussion section. And in some papers, there should also be a conclusion section. Please ask yourself, is there a potential personal bias in your being able to review this article fairly? either a positive bias or a negative bias. Although the review is a blinded process, and when we send, at least JMAS follows a blinded review process, that we send an article to a reviewer, that the reviewer does not know which author or which institution it has come from. But sometimes looking at the type of work that has been reported, it is at least in about 30-40% of the articles, it is easy to guess which institution that article may have come from. The editors obviously would have that prerogative straight away of assessing, because there is a first page or a title page file which tells you the department or the institution from where it is submitted. So please avoid either a positive bias. You feel that this has come from an institution or a department where you've got some friends. Yes, I'll review it favorably. Or it has come from somebody whom you do not particularly like so much. Oh, I think I'm going to give this a very harsh critical treatment. That's not a fair way to be a reviewer. Ask yourself also the question, am I suitably qualified or knowledgeable in this area to be able to review it fairly? So that is something that needs to happen at the first glance. Just quoting a paper which talked about, or which looked about reasons why articles get accepted more easily and why some of the other articles get rejected. So the timely and pertinent article which is pertinent to a current problem. Now this, in the current COVID-19 era, we have realized can in fact be a curse, because any article that you today sent out with the words COVID-19, it's almost like a magic wand. The moment you say COVID-19, all of us have seen articles of very poor quality being accepted by eminent journals just because they have that magic word COVID-19 in them. But generally, if the article pertains to something that is topical to a current problem, it has a higher chance of getting accepted. Is it, if it's an original article, is it a well-designed study with appropriate methodology, well written and follows a logical sequence of the author putting the points across, it's more likely to get accepted very easily. And is the language easy to comprehend? So yes, the English language and the ability for the readers to comprehend an article also plays an important role in its getting accepted. What are the common reasons for rejection? Every article has to have, original article particularly, has to have a problem statement, or what are we looking for, or what are we researching. So if that is lacking or insufficient, it forms a ground for rejection. Inaccurate or outdated review of literature, the sample size being too small or biased, inappropriate methodology. Now, it is always said that there are several other sins which an author may commit in writing an article, which are remediable or which are correctable with a lot of effort. But in an original article, if the research methodology has been faulty, there is no way of going back and reinventing the wheel or correcting that. So this could very well be a slide for the authors as well. When you are sending out a paper to a journal, please pay careful attention that none of these sins are there in your paper, because otherwise it's likely to be looked upon unfavorably. Inaccurate or inconsistent reporting of the data. Text which is hard to read and hard to figure out the flow of thoughts. Another common sin is over interpretation of the results. The author should always remember that what their results are, what their discussion is, what their conclusion is entirely based on the data that is presented in their paper. So often the authors are in the habit of writing in the discussion and the conclusion section what they had hoped to have seen in the paper rather than what they actually saw in the data. So that's an important element to guard against. And if the tables or figures are defective. Generally, it is said that there are two approaches to reading a manuscript when it comes to you as a reviewer, and both are fine. I mean, it's an individual preference, it's an individual style. You may sort of vacillate between the two from article to article. Not necessarily you will give all the articles the same treatment. So one is quick and cursory initial reading. And what is recommended, I'm going to refer a particular resource at the end of this slides. And this is something that I picked up from that particular series of lectures or a course which I did in the last few weeks online. So this is a person who says that when a reviewer gets a manuscript, look carefully at the tables and the figures first, and then read through the abstracts. Because the tables, figures, if they are well presented, and the abstract immediately gives you a feel for the paper as to what the paper is likely to be about and what it is going to be projecting. Then read through and look for three important things. What are the authors intending to study, or what is the main important question? Is the topic something that's going to be of interest to the readers of this journal? See, often there are well-written papers, but they are not necessarily good enough for your readers because they are completely out of the field of focus for your readers. So that you have to point it out politely to the author that yes, this is a well-written article, this is a well-conducted research, but unfortunately it is not suitable for the readership of our journal. Does the study attempt to provide answer to unanswered questions? However small, however trivial, this is an important part of any research. You're looking at some aspect which has not been previously thought of or previously researched, and it could make an important contribution to the research. Or the other style is detailed reading right from one word go, that you're looking at it very, very meticulously, carefully, line by line, jotting out your comments, criticisms, suggestions as you go along, preferably in a separate word file, or sometimes using the comments function of a word processor to jot it down in the margins. Both are fine, but ultimately what you need to do is to go through the article step by step, section by section. So when you read the abstract, the question that needs to be asked is, does the abstract appropriately summarize the manuscript? Are there discrepancies between the abstract and the manuscript in terms of any figures? For example, the abstract says there were 150 patients enrolled and 140 patients completed the study. But when you go through the manuscript, find the numbers are 152 and 141. That's a clear discrepancy. I mean, it does not really make the paper invalid, but it's a discrepancy which needs to be pointed out to the authors, and they need to be given an opportunity to correct it. If it's just been a slip of error, it should not happen. I mean, an author who's careful enough, who's sending an article to a good journal, would not let something like this slip by him. The third important question that the reviewer asks himself is, if I did not have access to the paper at all, if I read only the abstract, does it give me sufficient feel for the paper or what is expected in the paper? Can the abstract stand for itself is an important question to ask. Introduction. We see lengthy, long introductions which are like a review of all that has happened so far about in that subject which is being discussed or which is the focus of that paper. You should be able to pick up three aspects from the introduction, and generally as a writer you would restrict your writing to 3 short paragraphs. A brief paragraph about what is known about the subject that you're tackling in the paper, what is unknown or what are the gaps in the knowledge in that subject which has prompted you to undertake that research, and third, what is the hypothesis or what is the issue that you're addressing which is going to form the focus of your study. So this should be the introduction. And if, as we said before, one of the reasons for rejection is if the purpose of the study has not been spelled out properly by the authors, then that does not really make for a good paper. Material and methods, the fundamental way to look at this is, if the material and methods described in a paper were followed blindly and to the T by another researcher, will he be able to reproduce the study that is described here? So that is the single important criteria of on which a good material and method section is based. Do the authors provide enough justification for the methodology? For example, inclusion, exclusion criteria, specific techniques that they're going to use. How is the data being analyzed? Are the statistical methods being adequately discussed? So that should come in material and methods. Have the authors designed methods that could reasonably allow the hypothesis to be tested? So you may say that they set off to test a particular hypothesis, but all the information that they needed, or the way in which that information needed to be gathered, is not spelt out in the materials and methods section, then probably you're going to realize that the whatever happens after that, the results and the discussion are going to follow from this faulty path. So that's why I said initially that material and method section, if it is not thought out properly or is not well written, then the paper often becomes unsalvageable. Results. Are the study findings described systematically and clearly? And generally, they should follow the same format in which the material and method section discussed certain aspects. That the results section should follow the same order in which issues were taken up in the material method section. Are the results reasonable or expected, or they're unexpected? Both are fine. So in science, even negative results, as we all know, carry and hold value. So provided the authors are able to, in the discussion portion of the paper, discuss and debate them intelligently and provide adequate arguments. Are there results introduced in the results section which have not been discussed earlier in the material and methods? So you can't suddenly discuss some results which have not been alluded to in the materials and methods section. That's a cardinal sin. Discussion. This is often, as we all know from when we write, this is often the most difficult section of a paper to write. Because generally when we write something, we read a lot about that topic. And there is too many ideas to be put into the discussion aspect. But as a reviewer, you need to figure out, is the discussion concise? Does it stick only to the issues of hand? There should never be a very broad discussion around that topic. For example, if you're reading a paper, not necessarily in JMAS, but if you're reading a paper, let's say about breast cancer and smoking, or effect of smoking on breast cancer, the discussion should not go on general aspects about breast cancer or general aspects about ill effects of smoking. It should figure specifically the aspects in which both of them are tied up, and the effects of smoking on breast cancer are so all the papers quoted in this section should specifically combine the two aspects. Is the proposed hypothesis proven or negated? The research question which the author set out to ask right in the beginning, has that been answered satisfactorily? Again, are the conclusions justified by the results the authors got, or is there a tendency for the authors to over exaggerate what they have seen? What if there were any unexpected results, have they been accounted for? In any paper that you would review, particularly an original article, if you do not find 3, 4, or 5 lines which talk about the limitation of that study, then that author has not given enough thoughts in writing that paper. Are there any inferences drawn which are not supported by the data in the study? That's important. Figures and graphs. So particularly when it comes to intraoperative photographs or say laparoscopic pictures, are the figures of excellent quality? The figures, I mean, you cannot submit a paper to a journal, say in a how I do it section, and have pictures which are shot from a television screen in the operation theater. Unless they are really high quality images which are captured from a digital source, they're not going to go down well in a paper. Are the figures or graphs appropriate and appropriate in number and appropriately labeled. So all three things are important. Do the figures and graph add value to the paper? You need to make sure that the what is expressed in the graphs or figures is not necessarily duplicated verbatim in the text of the paper. That's a very bad thing to do. I'm not saying that disqualifies the paper, but it is something that needs to be noted and brought to the attention of the authors for them to be able to correct that. Would a different figure better illustrate the point that the author is trying to make? Or do they show all the important result? Do any arrows need to be added? Often when you have an intraoperative photograph, the legend actually describes what is seen in the figure. And for an experienced surgeon who is familiar with that surgery, it may be easy to spot what that figure is about. But for somebody who's not well versed with it, unless it is highlighted by way of an arrow, either a solid arrow or a black arrow, he may not be able to figure out what that image is about. And that needs to be pointed out to the authors. Do the legends provide clear explanation about the figure? The reader, when he's looking at a figure or a graph, should not have to go back to the text of the paper to figure out what that graph is trying to say. The legend should be explanatory enough that it should cover everything that needs to be said about that particular figure. Tables are the tables. They, first of all, a lot of authors submit tables which do not carry a title or a legend. Are there too many or too few tables? So again, each journal would permit certain number of tables and figures as a part of original articles or a part of case report. So you need to go back and forth and check with the instructions to the authors whether this is appropriate for that journal. Often this step should have been taken care of at a higher level of scrutiny by the editors or the sectional editors before it is passed on to a reviewer. But if it has not been done, if you feel that that is something that needs to be brought to the notice, it needs to be jotted down and conveyed to the author and to the editor. Do the columns have too many, the tables have too many columns? Generally, a good table is one which has 3, at the most 4 columns. If your table spreads across 8, 9, 10 columns, it's impossible to figure out what's being discussed in that table. Or does it have too many numbers? So number, percentages in parentheses, p-values, becomes very, very confusing. References. Do the reference follow the prescribed format? For example, JMAS follows the Vancouver formatting. So get yourself familiar with this formatting if you're not, and glance through the references to see if they follow the prescribed format and whether there are any formatting errors in terms of the colons, semicolons, etc. All this is generally taken care of at the level of the copy editing. What I'm trying to suggest is that if the references are badly formatted, it is an indication that the author has not done a good job overall with the paper, or he's inexperienced, and that needs to be brought out to his notice in a polite, subtle way, so that he can improve upon the paper which is submitted to you and also improve his scientific writing for the future. The next thing is, have the authors provided references for all the salient points which they have mentioned, and that they have not misquoted the reference. For example, it's a good idea to randomly pick out a paper which is referenced in a paper and actually track that original article. Once in a while, you will find that the authors have stuck that number in the superscript 27. And if you open article reference 27, it has nothing to do with what the authors are talking about in the discussion or the any appropriate section. So that's clearly misquoting a reference. If you are familiar with that field, and this is the importance of the sectional editors who are experts in certain areas, are there some important or recent references which have been left out by the authors, either knowingly or unknowingly? Knowingly, because it carry a different viewpoint and it does not support what that paper is about. or unknowingly because they've not been careful enough in performing their search for references. Are there too many or too few references? So when the paper is reviewed, generally most journals, JMAS asks you to do two things. One is an overall rating. So that's a broad rating. So should you ever give any paper a blanket accept rating? As I said, this should be very, very rare. There is almost no manuscript that cannot be improved by 1 to 5 or 10% by pointing, or it can be made better, shorter, and that's something that needs to be pointed out. If you send too many articles back to the editor with an accept rating, it may indicate that you've not really done a critical review or a critical job of which was assigned to you. Accept with revision usually means that you are seeking more clarification related to the methods, reorganization of the results in some way, shortening of certain sections, particularly the introduction or the discussion section, aligning the conclusions to the findings or what is being discussed there, revision to the reference section or to the figures, or once in a while it would be that the article is good, the article is well written, but it is submitted as the wrong article type, and that can be suggested to the authors by the reviewers. Reconsider with after major revision, we are now down the slope where the article is borderline. One does not have to give up on that article, but it means that this type of article is going to need a lot of effort in revisions. For the editors, one of the things that they need to keep in mind that suppose an article is sent back to the authors with a comment, reconsider after major revisions, and the reviewer has been painstaking enough to submit a long list of 20 suggestions. If you see that article back in your system within say 24 or 48 hours, that it has been uploaded again with major revisions, you have to be on your guard that the author may not have really put in the efforts to address each and every issue that was suggested by the reviewer. A major revision to an article, in my mind, takes at least a week, 10 days. You need to dig out some extra references. You need to reformat a lot of the paper. You need to revise or shorten your writing. And that generally cannot be done within 24, 48 hours by most authors. So that is something that you need to be wary of. So when the reconsider after major revisions goes back to the authors, one of these things are the issue, and they need to be followed religiously. Reject, as we've already discussed, is an unsalvageable paper. There is a major fault in the methodology of the paper, poorly conceptualized or poorly written. So that is one. The overall rating is one aspect, and the second usually is a descriptive review or descriptive paragraph that the reviewer is expected to submit separately, usually to the authors and to the editors. So what is the example of an informative review? That the comments are constructive, the overall rating that the reviewer had given are commensurate with what is written in the summary. And there is a note to the editor, which is again consistent with the rating and summary. And generally it carries a meaningful tone. Just going to share with you an example of an excellent review, one of the several excellent reviews that we've received at JMAS. So this was a paper on laparoscopic repair in children with traumatic bladder perforation. And this was a reviewer who had sent a review. I would say that this reviewer has really painstakingly gone through each and every aspect. Some authors would segregate the review into a line or two about abstract, a little bit about method, introduction, material, method, result, discussion, references, etc. But that's fine. But at least this author has taken pains to go through that paper and suggest many changes The authors followed all the changes, corrected the paper, and when it came back, it was accepted. There are several non-informative or poorly written reviews. The first of this is what I like to call the snapshot review. Good paper, excellent paper should be accepted. Or a review that gives you mixed signals, that is highly critical in the summary. When you're writing the summary of what goes to the authors, you are critical of several aspects, but the final recommendation does not really tally with that. For example, you may criticize a paper and in the final recommendation you say accept with revision. Please remember, accept with revision generally means that not too much needs to be changed in the paper. So this paper should ideally get reconsidered after major revisions. If you have been critical in pointing out several problems with the paper in your descriptive summary. The next one I like to call a hidden agenda review. So the comments in the section that goes to the author is fairly benign, but at the same time, there is usually a place for comments to be written which only are seen by the editors and which are not passed on to the authors generally. So in that, the reviewer is very harsh and critical, extraordinarily so. So that's again not a good thing. I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of this snapshot review from JMAS. Needs correction for English language, or nothing for the authors, but for the editors, rejected. Now, when you suggest something, so again, I'll go back to the first slide of this section. Please put yourself in the shoes of the author who has sent this paper. How would you feel if you received this particular type of remarks in your rejection letter? There is no insight into why this paper has been rejected by the reviewers or the editors. There is nothing to suggest or indicate whether this can be improved upon and maybe sent to another journal for consideration. So this is totally unhelpful. So that's the last slide. This is the resources about how to review the paper generally. This is the course that I was talking about. So if you go to Coursera, if you visit the Coursera website or visit the Stanford website, they have an excellent course on writing in the sciences. So this is an 8-week long course. You can do it at your pace. Generally, each week is about 2 hours of viewing material. So you can actually sit on a day and view continuously about 7 or 8 lectures which span about 2 hours. Take a brief assessment at the end of it and move on to the next week. So I would suggest most of us should do this course completely from week 1 to 8. Week 1 to 4 focus on better writing in terms of writing in active voice, correct use of punctuation marks, etc., etc. So week 5 and week 6 are the ones which are excellent, because week 5 talk entirely about how to write a good paper, and week 6 is about the peer review process. So as a reviewer, I would strongly recommend that you do the week 5 and 6. And these are several, these are some of the papers which I've provided you with the PubMed link on for how to review a good, how to conduct a good peer review.